Good afternoon and welcome to Hermes Friday afternoon or Friday lunchtime Q&A. Thank you very much for joining us, whether or not you're watching live or watching us later on YouTube. If you are watching on YouTube, do us a favour and subscribe. That way you'll get a notification the next time we're going live, and you won't forget, which is good for you and good for us. Just very quickly, why do we do these? Why do we do these live streams? I guess I've always said that the secret to our success is two things. We've got the right money, but also the right people. And by the right people, we don't just mean our in-house people. I mean, of course, our in-house team is excellent, state-of-the-art team, but we've also got excellent networks. And I guess that's part of it. The secret of our success is being able to deliver the right money, but also deliver the right external teams to solve problems. And today we've got three excellent panelists to highlight that point, I guess. We've got the whole country covered. We're going right around the country, and we're starting off today with Stuart Craig from Brisbane, and I'll bring Stuart in now. G'day, Stuart, how are you going?
G'day, Nick, I'm good, thank you.
Fantastic. So Stuart is with Safe Turnarounds. He's a turnaround advisor, director's advocate, and also I guess a cash flow specialist as well. In terms of, as I understand it, Stuart, you're very much focused on working the cash flows out and incorporating that into what you do. I mean, maybe you should say a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Well, our recent conversations just in the last few weeks have been primarily focused around cash flow forecasting, incorporating all those stakeholders in your business. That's from the clients, the employees, the bank, the financiers, all those other people, landlords and whatnot, into your cash flow forecasting, and the stimulus packages that have been on offer. But also as part of a wider discussion about a business continuity plan and how that looks. Business continuity is cash flow forecasting plus how you're going to operate, how you're going to deliver your product and services, commercials, the terms of business and all that sort of thing over a period of time. And that can have a couple of stages with 3 weeks, 13 weeks, 25 weeks, whatever it might be.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, you're always involved in, primarily involved in turnaround scenarios. And so I guess we've sort of got the turnaround scenario of all turnaround scenarios at the moment.
Yes.
With the current environment. And what sort of extra or new challenges does that bring to the table, or is it just the same model, or how does that change?
Well, I think with the insolvency liability provisions that were brought into until September, you've got a unique scenario where your directors can find themselves protected to some point, but also on the other side, they can't take action to enforce statutory demands on recalcitrant debtors and things like that. And so there's going to be an artificial mattress below, cash mattress below businesses for this period, which is clearly the federal government's initiative and motivation to keep business going for a while. So there's potentially three scenarios: is that businesses with a good foundation are going to be able to go through and hopefully, number one, they'll kick on after September when there's confidence comes back in the economy, or two, there is a safe harbor turnaround opportunity for businesses which are a little bit below that potentially, and then they'll move along, break even maybe, and then kick off with some great help from 888X and others like that. But sure. Then there's the businesses which don't have the foundation and we're probably struggling somewhat already. The stimulus will keep them going for a while, and their working capital will be limited. I was just talking about three scenarios. One is good businesses will survive. Two, the ones that are in the between will, run into a safe harbor turnaround perspective. And then three of those businesses which are going to have a life for another few months due to the stimulus, but really are going to die. they'll have to close
Well,
down.
I guess we've talked about over the last few weeks, we've had various terminology. Elegant dismount is one of them we've talked about. Maybe people taking the opportunity, if the business isn't going to survive, to hop off with a bit of dignity. But I think that something that you said a little bit earlier goes back to business model, and later on we'll talk a little bit about Virgin. I'm not a Virgin expert. I mean, I fly Virgin, but it is interesting that it seems to have had a flawed business model. But we'll get to that. I'll bring in Angelina next. Angelina Kozary she's a partner with Piper Alderman here in Sydney. So we've covered Brisbane, and now we're here in Sydney. How are you, Angelina?
I'm very well, Nick. How are you?
I'm very well indeed. And what keeps this Piper Alderman partner busy this week?
Well, it's been pretty quiet on the insolvency front at the moment, but generally what I'm hearing in the market is that a lot of people are just waiting for to see how long this lasts and to see what they get in terms of stimulus payments before making a call on what they do in terms of the future of their businesses. And so that's having a flow-on effect to my practice as an insolvency lawyer. But it's been, from another perspective, really interesting to be able to utilize a lot more technology in terms of court appearances and things like that. I think there's there might be a long-term shift in how we work coming out of this. We've been doing it for 2 months now, and things seem to be working a lot better than they were at the start. And there's been some really good road covered in terms of making sure that the courts are technologically compliant. Things like cross-examination are happening, and there's very little business disruption on the legal front. And I'm pretty sure that that's sort of happening through a lot of professional services firms. So it's been an interesting couple of months and week even from that perspective. A lot of this is just kicking the can down the road, for lack of a better way to put it.
Yeah, look, I think the thing is, we're finding too that I've got a whiteboard in front of me here where if someone rings me up with a new deal, I put it on the whiteboard. And I actually last Friday I had a guy ring me and he said, "Oh, look, we've got what have I written down there? Bridging of PE buy-in. So private equity was going to buy in, and could we look at it? It looks fantastic, but the phone hasn't rung since." And I think that people are sitting on their hands and seeing how things go. Now, you were saying to me earlier in the week that you've set up certain processes to be able to deal with some high volume situations. I think it was something to do with leasing or with tenants or landlords.
So one of our leasing partners in our Sydney office, Margot King, is working with a lot of people in terms of rent negotiations coming out of COVID-19, and has a special package set up. So if anyone does have a need for that, anyone's clients or contacts have a need for that, feel free to reach out to me and I'll put you in touch with Margot, because she's got a great product. It's cost effective in a time where I think people are very hesitant to exercise discretionary spending, and legal seem to be on that discretionary spending front. And sort of one of the things that I'm concerned about going into the post-COVID-19 world is a lot of contract renegotiations happening either verbally or poorly documented, because people are not getting lawyers in to properly draft those documents, and what kind of flow-on effect that might have in terms of recovery actions and just the ongoing conduct of people's business post-COVID-19.
Yeah, I guess it's one of those things where you might think that spending the money on legals is optional, but what is it that lawyers say? Something about the person who acts for themselves has got a fool for a client or something. Is that the one?
100% correct.
Yeah. Now we're not going to go across the Nullarbor to Perth and bring in Daniel Woodhouse. How are you going, Daniel?
Great, Nick. Yourself?
Not too bad. Now, Daniel's the managing director over in Perth at FTI Consulting, and he's got the corporate finance and restructuring team in Perth there. What's keeping you busy at the moment, Daniel? What are people mainly ringing you when the phone rings? What's the most common asked question?
Yeah, look, it's really an interesting market at the moment, and sort of mirroring Stuart and Angelina's comments, it's the formal side of the market has definitely gone quiet. So people aren't definitely not ringing up and asking about voluntary administrations and enforcement actions. It's quite the opposite. We're getting a lot of the calls coming in at the moment are in relation to our business is being dramatically impacted by COVID-19 and how do we get through. So a lot more of that strategic restructuring advice being given and financial advising type roles. So this week I've been helping two private equity clients with significant amounts of cash into investments that cross-border investments. So they're kind of looking at, well, both deeply different sectors, but both deeply impacted by travel restrictions and various flow-on effects from COVID-19. So they're looking at, well, how can we restructure the business such that we can provide a barrier around what is the core business and what has been working particularly well, so that when we get into the COVID-19 environment, we have a business.
That's interesting. Look, I'm sure that's something that Stuart does as well, but you're talking about really identifying what the core is, I suppose, when you're looking at those scenarios?
Yeah, exactly. Cutting back to, a number of things. You're really looking at restructuring the business about providing a sustainable business at the back end of it, and it's going to depend upon the circumstances. I think the circumstances we're dealing with at the moment are pretty bespoke. But what that might look like for a different business for businesses is different. So, are we cutting it back to what their core service line is? Are you needing to look at how you might restructure debt? So we've looked. Our team over East have been working on a couple of fairly public matters that people will know. So, the Flight Centre matter and the Webjet matter. So, acting as financial advisors on those businesses. So that they, obviously impacted by what's going on.
I know that at FTI you're involved a fair bit with private equity players as well. That's correct?
That's right. Yes.
Yeah, and I guess what I'm hearing is that on one hand the private equity firms are sitting on cash and they're looking for opportunities or hoping for opportunities that come out of this. On the other hand, they have portfolios of businesses that might be showing signs of impairment as well.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So we kind of, our private equity clients at the moment are really looking at both of those situations. And in fact, when we were talking to them before, or just as this was starting to unfold, they were literally gearing up in terms of releasing cash into their various businesses around the globe in terms of to take advantage of exactly some of these opportunities that are going to flow out. And I think it's one of the really interesting things. There is still plenty of money out there at the moment for the right business. So, we looked at what was probably considered quite a surprising outcome with Flight Centre and Webjet, and that people are prepared to put money into those businesses in the current environment. But people are taking a longer term view on those businesses and saying the underlying economics work, the businesses are sound and sustainable, and we see this as an opportunity to buy in.
At a discount, presumably.
Yeah, look, the prices are definitely at a discount at the moment, and you'd expect them to be. And that's part of the appeal to your private equity and your fund players. They'll be looking at exactly that.
Yeah, it is a very interesting dynamic, isn't it? I guess, and it applies to lenders as much as it applies to private equity as well. There's obviously, if you've got appetite, you would expect there will be opportunities that will come up. But by the same token, you've got to look in house and make sure that your own ship's in order as well. Okay, we'll move on to some headlines. I clicked this one. I know that the stock. I'm not a stock market expert. I'm useless at picking stocks. But what's interesting in this picture here is that the market dipped dramatically, obviously, as we know. And I guess you could have almost bought any one of those dips, and you're probably looking okay at the moment. And as I say, I know the market's come off today, but what is it that should we be taking something away, I guess something positive out of the fact that the market is up? We've got down to 4,500 points. then gone up to 5,500 points. Is that reflecting optimism going forward, do you think? And is that something that we should, we should be looking, I guess, positively at? I'll start with you, Stuart.
Yeah, well, is there two things that happen that impact the stock market? I'll be a little bit sarcastic, but is one the American president, and two what our rates are with the COVID coronavirus infections and whatnot. I know in Queensland we've had second or third day of no infections, no more cases. Are they the two things that are driving the stock market at the moment? It's let's say it's all about confidence. And a lot of the world I operate in, what the stock market is doing is doesn't have really a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month impact on, or a noticeable one, on business. That might be a little bit different for other levels of the community, but
well, what I'm wondering about though, Stuart, is that what's got me is the stock market tends to look forward. So, and the American stock market's been kicking up as well. Again, it came off last night, but it's also come up similarly. So, is it that this whole COVID crisis economically isn't going to be as bad as what we thought it was? We've got high, unemployment is growing, and unemployment's not coming off. There's more and more people seeking unemployment benefits, etc. Businesses are closing. So right now in the real economy, it's a reasonably bleak picture. But when you look at the way the stock market's interpreting the future, and maybe it speaks a little bit to what Daniel was saying earlier about Flight Centre, etc. What do you think, Angelina?
Call me an eternal optimist, but I think, and this is something that I've spoken to you about before, Nick, I think Australians are quite agile, and we have this benefit of being an island and being relatively isolated. So closing of borders is a pretty, drastic but straightforward process for us. And I think in terms of long-term recovery, I think it will happen. But consistent with things that Stuart's been saying, the reality is that the recovery is going to be very different for companies who are already in trouble. And that includes a lot of people in the retail and hospitality industries and presumably the travel industries. But that sort of recovery is going to be very different to companies where they don't have the right structure in place already.
Yeah.
But I'm optimistic about what the future is going to look like. And I think now we're moving into a recovery plan rather than a crisis management plan. And I think people need to start thinking about where they see their businesses being in, 6 to 12 months' time. And I should say as well, I know nothing about the stock market. I don't do that kind of work. So, and it's not something that is a personal interest of mine that I follow closely. But looking at how those trends reflect on the SME space, which is in my wheelhouse, that's how I perceive the market generally at the moment.
Right. Daniel, I guess obviously the circles that you move in, I suppose you'd be seeing more listed entities and what have you. I mean, I'm interested in, I guess a firm like yours, you'd be scenario planning and have some sort of a view on what things are going to look like 3 and 6 months out. I mean, do you think the stock market is onto something, or is it are they not seeing what the rest of us are seeing?
Look, I'm again a bit like Angelina. I'm the eternal optimist with these sorts of things, and apart from trying to avoid looking at my share portfolio and superannuation fund at the moment, because it's obviously, like everybody's taken a real hit. I look at this as very consistent with what we've seen in other economic shocks. If we go back to the GFC, we had obviously a massive shock to the economy and the stock market at that point in time. And then an extended period of recovery. I think that time was about 6 years for the market to kind of recover. So I see the current market as an opportunity, because I think that there are, and again, this is going on with what Stuart and Angelina have said, there's the underlying business principles of good performing businesses don't change because of this. That they are hit like every other business, but ultimately, you look at Coles and Woolworths are selling, staples. They will continue to need to be there, and as long as they're well managed and driving profits, then you'd expect their share prices to improve. So I think over time we will see the market bounce. And look, again, I'm I don't play in this space either, but if we look at historically what has happened, the market should rebound, and I think right now is a real opportunity to be buying good value or undervalued stocks, depending on the business you're looking at. So I see it as an opportunity also.
Yeah, I mean, look, again, I'm sort of not necessarily thinking about whether or not you should buy stocks, but just wondering that because the stock market has come up 1,000 points, whether or not that's a good sign for the economy. We'll move on to the next one. I think. Oh, we've gone too far. Hang on a sec. All right. So this particular article here is specifically talking about the bondholders of Virgin have got their own advisors. Reminds me of, I can't remember what matter it was, 20 years ago or longer probably, when Malcolm Turnbull represented the Belgian dentists, I think they were, who were bondholders. I can't remember what the entity was, but so the bond. I guess I don't necessarily want to get into the nitty gritty of that, but a couple of things. Firstly, already Stuart and Daniel, you've talked about identifying the core business and just using Virgin as a case study. I mean, there was an article in the paper last week by Chris Corrigan, who at one time was at the helm of Virgin, and he was saying that they had a very simple business model. They had the whole fleet constituted of the same aircraft, so it was efficient from that point of view. It was all about low cost. They didn't have business class. I wonder whether or not that's if there's lessons there for small and medium-sized businesses alike. Daniel, I'll start with you.
Yeah, look, I think the Virgin matter it's obviously very topical and very interesting at the moment. And, it's probably worth noting that, Virgin had issues prior to COVID-19. There's a class of companies that we call zombie companies, and they're effectively companies that can't meet their principal and interest repayments. They can meet operating costs, and then that goes on for a number of years. Well, Virgin sat in that class of business. So it's fair to say they've had problems now for an extended period. And you kind of think that COVID-19 may have brought on what needed to happen with Virgin. And I wonder whether or not somewhat of the appointment has been strategic to deal with some of those issues. So I think what is going to happen with Virgin is hopefully very different than what happened with Ansett, and that's probably more circumstantial. But there are going to be some really interesting buy plays come out of this, and that's going to be in relation to the stakeholders of very different interests. So if we look at who's secured over Virgin at the moment, most of them are over specific planes. There's no, as I understand it, no security that blankets the entirety of the business. So we're going to get to a situation where you've got people who have interest in domestic planes and flights, and then you're going to have others that will be on the wide body or the planes they use to fly internationally. And you can see a situation where those interests will diverge, because anyone wanting to buy the business won't particularly want to be encumbered with planes that are not going to be suitable for anything but domestic business, at least in the short term.
Yeah, look, I think it's an interesting question about business model as well. What business they were in the business of the low cost. As I say, they didn't have class, they didn't have business lounges. And look, I've been a frequent flyer of Virgins for the last number of years, and so I've got a vested interest in that point of view. But what do you think, Stuart? I mean, there is that. I mean, they had the low cost model, and then they tried to compete head to head with Qantas with full service. I guess you could call it that, the full service versus the budget model. I mean, you must see a little bit of that when you're advising small businesses.
Yeah, there's a constant pressure, I guess, at that listed level where shareholders want more value from their investment and more profits and more growth. But arguably, they moved away from that low cost model, core operating model, and they had to add on more and more and more from that demand from the shareholder or the executive level to do more at the board level. They need to do more. They need to do this and this and this, because there's a constant pressure to grow and to provide better returns. And so that pressure, I guess, with the pressure of being able to pay for all the planes, those operating overheads and whatnot. I mean, it must have been very difficult for them. And with all due respect to Mr. Corrigan, he was potentially worried about criticism that would reach back to his time. But he seems quite right from the outside, from our perspective, is that he was doing it there, and where it's come to here is a long way from where it started.
But he had all the same aircraft. He had a low cost model, so he had a very defined place in the market. But look, I know that when I meet when I go out and see a business for the first time, I think one of the best questions that you can ask someone is, why do your customers buy from you and not from the business down the road? And that if you can explain, what your value proposition and what your business model is, I think it's a powerful thing.
Your core, the core operating model, or your core product or service you offer, you don't want to get in the past couple of years, you don't want to get diverted from that, even if you add to it. But now is a time that you can pivot and reset what that model looks like clearly, and then start to work towards that. Sorry,
Angelina, I wanted to ask you another thing that this particular article brings up, and actually Daniel identified it even more so than what I was aware, is competing secured creditor interests. So I'm sure you've probably been involved in one or two secured creditor dust-ups where you've got different secured creditors. God forbid with the unsecureds, but what do you think that in this environment that tension changes, or what experience have you had with that?
I don't think that anything is going to change in terms of competing interest between secured creditors just because of COVID-19. I think what is going to change are things that are happening in Virgin, for example, like Perth Airport trying to retain the aircraft and exercise liens. I think people are trying to explore and exploit any opportunity that they have to get priority, whether or not it's right at law or not, just to put additional pressure to get their money back. And I think what happens with over-leveraged businesses like Virgin is that there is so much debt which they've acquired cheaply, like you've said, and that debt still exists from the creditor's perspective to pay their ongoing liabilities as well. So I think if we see anything from COVID-19 in terms of creditors, I think it will be a strong pushback on I guess reducing their security or lessening their position, and people will be a lot stronger in pressing for payments. And I think that's even going to flow through to things like unfair preference claims that are going to come out of this, not only in Virgin but in other administrations. I think creditors are going to be a lot more vocal about their rights. I think creditors are going to be a lot more resistant to preference claims when they come. And Daniel, I don't know what you're getting at as an insolvency practitioner at the moment, but I just think that it will COVID-19's ongoing impact in the creditor space will really be about exerting as much power as they possibly can to their own businesses going.
Okay. All right. Well, look, we'll move on to the next one. So I've got here, NAB ushers in banking's ugly new normal. Now, what some of these articles are about are the NAB and I think the ANZ. Well, the NAB raised capital and cut its dividends. Correct me if I'm wrong here. And I think the ANZ announced that they were cutting dividends as well. They're basically trying to preserve capital or raise capital to preserve capital. And there's analysis. There's been a couple of different bits of analysis basically saying that the banks are looking at anything upwards of $30 billion in write-offs, in particular to their business clients, obviously. I know that when we've been trying to deal with the asset management parts of banks have been very hard to get on the phone because they're very busy just with COVID payments. What do you think, Daniel? Do you think that the banks are lining up to take some hits?
Look, I think inevitably they're going to come. Yes, so I think so. Yes, is the short answer, and I think this kind of flows into some of the things that Stuart was saying earlier around. There are going to be businesses that fail through this, and there are a number of reasons. But essentially, what you're doing is you're not cutting liabilities and expenses that are being incurred with some of these stimulus packages. But what you are doing is taking away the corresponding revenue. So you're kind of getting to this position where businesses are going to have the same amount of liabilities that they would have had, but the revenue through this period is going to be significantly less.
Well, servicing is obviously going to be difficult, but then there's the asset values and all that sort of stuff that comes into play as well.
Yeah, and I think it's more than that. It's not just servicing through this period. I think it's going to be the economy's just not going to restart. You're not going to go out there on day one of COVID-19, post COVID-19, and businesses are going to be able to meet their rent, their lease liabilities, and their bank payments and things like that. This is going to be something that's going to have to be rolled out over an extended period of time for businesses to survive. Otherwise, we are going to see mass failures. Yeah, I mean, look, the other thing that I would add is that we've got to appreciate that the banks have just come through fairly rigorous periods with banking royal commissions and Senate inquiries and things like that. So there may also be, and I don't know, but there could be a strategic element to dealing with write-offs and things like that in a COVID-19 environment. That I some of the things we talk to businesses about is that there can be some silver linings to what's going on at the moment, and that is everyone understands what's going on with COVID-19. If to give yourself the best opportunity of being able to come through this, then there is really an opportunity if you're proactive here to restructure your balance sheet and make yourself stronger.
Do you think that we can, if we're seeing that the banks are, if they are going to be taking hits of upwards of $30 billion, I mean, are there opportunities? Do you think that they'll be open to negotiation on for haircuts and what have you?
Look, I think so. Yes. I mean, I think that the banks were open. They're open to a whole host of things that they, traditionally wouldn't have seen. I think that I've definitely assisted company side where there's been some negotiations around banks taking haircuts on debt, but I mean, obviously where they are well secured and their position is strong. I mean, they still have obligations to shareholders to make sure that they, so all of those things play into it. But I think yes, I mean, people will be flexible through this period, I would have thought.
And Stuart, I'm thinking that whenever we do come out of this on the other side, a lot of businesses are really going to be looking at, I think, their capital requirements. Is something that Daniel touched on there. They've gone through, they've emptied the hollow log, or the log's now hollow. They've emptied their stores just to survive. And then when business does start up again, they're going to almost need startup capital, I think, is what they're going to be looking for. And I guess that's where your cash flow forecasting is certainly going to become popular.
Well, yes. I mean, their working capital to invest in their business to get kicked along as well as they possibly can be is going to be hugely important. And that's where you come into the picture, of course, Nick, and their existing financiers and banks and whatnot. It's enormously, especially come October when the JobKeeper's ceased, the tax office is open for business again. You're going to have to negotiate an instalment plan for all the accumulated taxes you haven't paid over a period, and then you actually got to go out and woo your clients and see what can you do to expand your offering or consolidate your offering to your existing clients and seek more clients and start to get the ball rolling. And I mean, you look at some industries that things are ticking along at the moment, and their working capital is fine. Manufacturing and logistics, supply chain, blue collar recruitment, things like that. And in the mines and everything, the mines are rolling along. So your working capital, as always, is extremely important. but the ability to go to have that some liquid cash to actually grow and invest, take on a new client, take on a new contract to supply another 50 people to the manufacturing guy who doesn't want those.
That's what I'm expecting. That we'll get hit with people say, right, I've just won a job, I need to put 50 people and a couple of machines out, and we've run out of money. Can you help us? And that's when we'll be saying, well, look, we'll need to see how this thing cash flows, etc. I saw this article here. Actually, this is from the Wall Street Journal, and I was thinking that this whole COVID crisis, there's things that we haven't even thought of, and this is an article about a lot of beer is sitting in pubs, I guess. You imagine all those kegs of beer and what have you that are just literally going stale. I guess there must be a fair bit of that. The things that I wouldn't have thought of, but yeah. Have you got any clients with stale beer, Daniel?
No, I don't, Nick, but I'm having a bit of a laugh because I was aware of that being an issue, and I've seen some creative solutions. So I'm aware that there's a pub in Melbourne that's actually pouring beer into takeaway containers, if you like, or takeaway bottles, and selling takeaway beers out of the kegs. So people are dealing with it that way, but it's I think, look, it is really interesting, and it comes back, and I'm sure Stuart and Angelina both said this, but the businesses that are pivoted and are nimble in the way they're dealing with it and coming up with creative solutions, they're continuing to keep revenue coming through the door through periods where others who are less nimble or less creative are not. So there's always you always need to be thinking nimbly and quickly. And I think, Stuart, you touched on this point earlier. I think one of the difficulties that, and I think, Nick, this will be right in your wheelhouse is, when we start to come out of this, credit will be difficult, I think, and not just debt funding, but just even working capital funding. So if you're supplying into a business and the business has got no cash and it needs terms, I'd be advising my clients, you want to be trying to get cash up front or at least your terms as low as possible to mitigate, and that's obviously not in the best interest of the party seeking funding, or credit. So those are going to be all issues.
I'd refer anyone watching to go to our very first live stream where I spoke with Travis Dix from NCI, and we talked about he's in credit insurance. We talked about all the sort of things that people should be looking out for. Angelina, I haven't seen. Yeah, the Iron Duke hasn't been handing out buckets of beer, unfortunately. Not that I noticed. That's the local pub to where Angelina and I are right now. Look, we are sort of running out of time, so I'll just. Has anyone got any sort of questions they'd like to ask any of the other panelists?
I'm interested in what the Daniel or Angelina think about your business model for your office spacing or restaurant spacing into the future. What's your business model going to look like when you can only have 4 people in that space, where you used to have 10 squished into the FTI Consulting Perth office, where you have them there like chickens in a hen yard, in a thing like this? Now they've got to be like this. So it's going to be interesting. What do you think? The business model?
I think one of the big long-term impacts that's going to come from this is professional services firms renting huge amounts of office space, realizing how productive people are in flexible work arrangements. I think it's going to have a big long-term impact, and I'm talking over the next 2-3 decades as leases run out. I think that's going to be the biggest impact on space. But at the moment, I think we're finding that the social distancing thing is fine in a professional services environment, just because there are so many people who are working remotely, and we've got the technology set up to be able to do that. I'm obviously working from home at the moment, but it's I think the bigger impact is going to be this long-term issue with professional services firms just not leasing the same kind of floor space that they are now, saving huge amount in terms of their overheads moving forward.
Well, that's going to impact the super funds and all the rest of it. Look, we are out of time, so I would like to say thank you very much to Stuart Craig in Brisbane. Thanks for joining us, Stuart. Thank you, Angelina Kozary from Sydney, and Daniel Woodhouse for Perth. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Cheers.